Part two, I'm going to make some positive suggestions about how we can use these corpora in interesting ways. So if you look at the outline, my first remark is pessimistic. I say linguists are not making as much use of translation corpora as we could, and our use of them is unsophisticated. Of course, there is interesting work happening. We just saw the people from Brighton doing interesting work with parallel corpus. But as I think they would agree, their corpus is small compared to the monolingual corpora that we have these days. And also, there aren't many places where interesting work is happening. I want to talk a little bit about the practical problems which explain why the use of these corpora is unfortunately smaller than is possible. And then I want to make a couple of suggestions about how we can use translation corpora, using word frequency and using phraseological patterns. Now, I am an enthusiast for parallel corpora. I think they have marvelous potential resources, fantastic possible research tools. Just to give you a small example of why I like parallel corpora. If we take the French word partout, which basically means everywhere, so it's a normal French word for everywhere. And if we look in the best French-English dictionary, which is the Collins-Robert, and we look at partout, we see everywhere. We also see a few other examples of translations in phrases. So we have take all over, and we have all over the place, and then we have specialized use in sport. Okay, now, if we look in the corpus for partout, so I just give you a couple of examples of translations of partout into English. In example number 2, we have that have become commonplace. The French says que l'on retrouve partout, that one finds everywhere. So it would have been possible for the translator to simply say that we find everywhere. But no, the translator chose to say that have become commonplace. Next example, number 3, planter de fleurs partout, literally planted with flowers everywhere. The translator has instead used the expression full of flowers. Now, we don't find either of these possibilities indicated in the Collins-Robert dictionary. Okay, we don't find either of these translation possibilities. And if we look in the corpus, we find many other translations of phrases containing partout into English. Now, at this point, we need to ask some questions. Are these two translations, example 2 and example 4, are they good translations? Are they good English? It's not an easy question, it's a subjective question, although a corpus can help, because if we find these kind of translations frequently in a corpus, then it's reasonable to assume that they are natural English, good quality translations. The next question, are they typical? Are they typical translations? Are they frequent translations? Or are they just individual translations by creative translators who are solving a specific problem on a specific occasion? So possibly of interest if we're interested in how translators solve creative problems, but not interesting if we're trying to compare English and French more generally. I don't know the answer to those two questions. Okay? I don't know, but it's at least possible that this is interesting information which should be somehow incorporated in good bilingual be available to learners of the two languages and should be available for people who teach translation and do research in contrastive linguistics. It's possible that this is useful information. In order to be confident that this is useful information, we would need a large corpus. We need a large and textually varied corpus. So a corpus with many different types of text. Unfortunately, we do not have corpora of this kind. And this leads me on to my next point. Okay, there are practical problems in producing translation of corpora. I just want to say a few words about these. The first one is availability. So even for the obvious Western European languages, English, French, Spanish, German, there are no translation corpora which are freely available, which are textually diverse, easy to use, able to be searched in sophisticated ways, and of high quality, and which are also large. Okay, it's unfortunately that seems to be the case at the moment. So that's the first point. Secondly, for translation corpora to be interesting, they need to be of good quality. Poor quality translations are of no interest if we want to use corpora for bilingual lexicography and for contrastive linguistics. So corpora need to have translation quality. What does this mean? Well, as a minimum, it's important to know which is the source language. Many translation corpora use texts from the European Union and from the United Nations and other international organizations. Often it's impossible to tell which is the original language, the source language, and which is the translation. We need to be sure that the translator was a skilled professional. If possible, we want a guarantee that the translation was checked before being published. D, we want to know that the translation was published by an organization which takes quality seriously. And E, we need the corpus text to be scrutinized by a skilled bilingual. All these criteria involve work. They involve work and expense. It takes time to compile a corpus that meets these criteria. And if a corpus does meet these criteria, then we turn to the next problem, which is copyright. Okay, if we want to compile a corpus, particularly containing interesting texts, for example, fiction texts. Suppose if you go to any bookshop in France or Spain or Germany, you will find many books which are translated by international authors. That is, authors whose work is translated routinely into many different languages. It would be great to have these texts in a corpus. However, obtaining copyright for these kind of texts is a nightmare. Okay, the legal issues are unclear, and what is needed is a large consortium of people with time and energy, access to good legal advice, and so on. Because this involves a great deal of work and expense, what people tend to do is they compile their own small corpus and use it for their own research, as I do, as the people in Brighton do, as people in a few other places do. But it's hard to make corpora available to anyone over the internet or in other ways because of copyright questions. Then there are technical questions. For a corpus to be usable for serious research, it needs to be edited. So it just needs work to make it neat and tidy. It needs to be aligned great deal about this. Alignment means the computer has to know which part of the text in the source language corresponds to which piece of text in the target language. Alignment can be partly done automatically. There are alignment programs available. Typically, alignment programs need manual editing to make them perfect. Alignments can be major practical problem. Translation corpora needs to be lemmatized to be useful. Again, this can be done. There are automatic lemmatization programs, but again, this involves work and they need to be manually checked. They need to be composed of more modern texts, so it's very easy to find translations of 19th and 18th century texts on the internet. No copyright problems. Unfortunately, the language used is often old language. What we need is modern texts in a corpus, and again, this is hard to provide, partly for copyright reasons. And finally, corpora needs to be easy to use. So you should be able to use the corpus without needing a team of computer specialists to help you. Obviously, if you want to do sophisticated searches in the corpus, it's reasonable to expect computing expertise. So to use CQP, as we saw in the previous talk, it takes a certain amount of expertise to use the CQP. But ideally, it should be possible to do a quick search of the corpus without computer expertise and a sophisticated search. So with each of these criteria, the labour and the expense increases. So these are some of the reasons why we don't have large, easily available, textually diverse translational corpora. What about the internet? What is there available on the internet? Well, there are some translation corpora which can be searched directly on the internet. I'll just give you a couple of examples which I've found easy to use. So for French and English, there is Cabal 2 from the University of Brighton, which has newspapers in French and English. Very easy to use, easy to search on the internet. There is a corpus in Spain called Cluvi, which again is easy to use. It has quite a large range of languages in it. Again, I've used it for French and English and Spanish. There are also now some large corpora available on the internet. Two in particular which I recommend. One is called My Memory, the other is called Opus. Both of them can be searched directly. Both of them are large. Opus is enormous. I haven't indicated the size, I don't know, it just grows and grows and grows. However, the quality varies, and the texts, many of the texts are computing manuals, so information about how to use a piece of computer software, which is, a corpus needs to contain text at this time, but it also needs to contain other types of text. Computing manuals obviously are not that interesting, and often they use a lot of, often the original language is English, and the translation uses an unusual amount of English terms. Opus also includes many texts from the European Union, again an obvious and productive source of texts. Again, the quality varies. European Union English is not the same as British or American English, as I'm sure many people here know. And as I said at the beginning, often it's hard to know which is the original. Okay, so these are some practical problems. Apologies for bringing you bad news. I hope my enthusiasm in the remainder of the talk might counteract this. So how can we advance our understanding of language and translation using translation corpora? Well, I suggest two strategies. Firstly, frequency. I won't say Basically, I look at words which occur frequently and words of medium frequency. Basically, what I was trying to do was ask, how many nice surprises do we find? Now, I use nice surprise as a technical term. A nice surprise is a translation which is not found in a bilingual dictionary. So the two translations of part 2 that I showed you right at the beginning, full of libels and so forth, they're nice surprises because we don't find them in the bilingual dictionary, but we find them in the corpus. So what we want to do with a translation corpus is find large numbers of nice surprises. Where are we going to find these? Well, we're not going to find them with the most frequent words, because the most frequent words tend to be grammatical morphemes, words and morphemes which you won't learn a lot from a translation corpus, usually about these. It's the medium frequency. So what I found, this is page 3 of the handout, right at the bottom of page 3. There was words that occurred between 100 and 1,000 times per million words where we found the most nice surprises. And again, I'll give you at the top of page 4 a few examples. So a translation corpus will tell us interesting things about some words and phrases. Not concrete nouns, usually. So if I look at the table in a corpus, I know more or less what I'm going to find in a translation corpus. So we need to know, we need some guidance, some guidelines where to look in the corpus. And my suggestion, this is my 2010 paper, is medium frequency words between 100 and 1,000 times frequency. Now, more recently, and this is the new material which I'll just go through very briefly, another strategy is to look for phraseological patterns. Okay. And this is based on work by Patrick Hanks, a very interesting lexicographer and theoretician. He was one of the main principal lexicographers in the new Oxford Dictionary of English, now called the Oxford Dictionary of English. Very innovative and interesting monolingual dictionary of English. Hanks has written a huge book. This is Hanks 2013, explaining the way he approaches language in terms of what he calls norms and exploitations. And the key concept that I've taken from Hanks is this notion of a phraseological pattern. And what Hanks proposes is that if you look at a verb, an English verb like throw, instead of distinguishing different meanings of throw, so sense 1, to use your hand to send an object through the air, like to throw tear gas canisters, and meaning number 2, to force someone to go to prison as punishment. He says, Hanks proposes that we actually store these phraseological prototypes in our heads rather than distinct meanings. So my suggestion is we look for phraseological patterns, distinct phraseological patterns in a translation corpus. In order to do this, I drew on some work by Helge Dybvik from Norway, who suggested that words with wide meanings should have a larger number of translations than words with narrow meanings. Or in my terminology, we would expect to find more nice surprises from words with wide meanings than with narrow meanings. So what I did was I looked at a pair of verbs in French, expliquer, which means to explain, which is a specific meaning, and then the verb dire, to say. And what I found, and this is reported on page 6, is that we find patterns, phraseological patterns, which are distinct. We find more of those with the wider sense verb with dire than with expliquer. the examples are 21 to 30 on the handout. Almost there. The final thing I did was I did the same kind of thing for the verb to throw in English and German, focusing just on the sense of throwing or firing an object. And again, I compared throw with fire, throw being the more general verb, and again I found more phraseological patterns which were distinct for throw than I did for fire. So I conclude that I can propose some guidelines for how to use translation corpus to find nice surprises. Look for medium frequency words, look for phraseological patterns which are distinct in the two languages. And in those ways we can promote research in translation corpora if we can overcome the practical problems which we spoke about. That's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We have time for one short question, please.
Just one short question. You mentioned video frequency there, but in cases like 15 and 16, they are not about exactly collocations like answer to this question or whatever. So do you count these as video frequency collocations too? As explique versus answer on this question?
Okay, I don't know is the answer. We have to look at something. I don't have frequency information for these verbs, but my point here is that the phraseological patterns are not the same. That's the